Hi everyone. Before we dive into the actual Aeneid itself, I wanted to provide a short video detailing the historical events that led up to the Aeneid and the historical events that were transpiring while the Aeneid was being written. Because for this epic, it's going to be very important to understand the political and cultural context for the work. So this guy named Virgil lived between 70 and 19 BCE. He was a Roman. He was born in Mantua, Italy, and that town is in northern Italy, right in between Milan and Venice for the most part. He was a scholar who studied philosophy, medicine, poetry. The Aeneid was not his first work, however. His first two works were called the Eclogues and the Georgics. The Eclogues are about shepherds and pastoral life, and the Georgics are didactic poems, so that means they're educative poems. They aim to educate the audience about agriculture, beekeeping, and stuff like that. So the Aeneid is quite a departure from his previous work, but these two poems that he published prior to the Aeneid were so popular and so well received that everyone was like, this guy has to be the one to write our national epic, which is the function the Aeneid is supposed to serve. In fact, Augustus, whom you've probably heard of, also known as Octavian, before he became Augustus is actually a title, asked him to write this national epic as a part of his political and religious program for Rome. Legend holds that the Aeneid, as an entire epic poem, was unfinished at Virgil's death in 19 BCE, but it was to the point of completion where Augustus was like, nah, we're going to publish it anyway. And if we were reading it in Latin, it'd be really easy to spot how it's unfinished in certain parts. There are certain half lines, so complete sentences, but ones that end in the middle of a line of dactylic hexameter. And that is to say, yes, this poem is written in dactylic hexameter in Latin, not in Greek, and it was written first. It was not delivered orally, and it was not constructed orally. So with all that under our belt, let's jump into the history and the cultural context that leads up to the writing of the Aeneid. So Roman history starts with the royal period, which is between 800 and 509 BCE, and this is where we get the founding legends that you might be familiar with, so stories about like Romulus and Remus and the overthrow of the Etruscan kings. And then in 509, we get the onset of the Republican period, right? So the Roman Republic comes into being. It's established as the Res Publica, that's the Latin word for it, SPQR, the Senatus Populusque Romanus. And during this period, we have lots of expansion and civil unrest. We get Julius Caesar's rise and death, and then Octavian defeats Antony right at the end in 27 BCE, which ushers in the Principate of Augustus. And this is the period that we're going to be focusing on heavily while we talk about the Aeneid. Okay, so the Principate of Augustus lasts between 27 BCE and 14 CE. Octavian, so Julius Caesar's adopted nephew, becomes Augustus. So Augustus is a title. It means something like increaser, or very revered, or holy. So then, for the imperial age between 14 and 476, probably the longest of all these ones we're going to be talking about, and this is where the long line of Roman emperors comes in that you've heard or seen, in your history classes. So this period begins with the death of Augustus, and it just continues on emperor after emperor until 284, during the emperorship of Diocletian, in which the empire is split into east and west. Then it's reunified in 330 by Constantine. It lasts a little bit longer after that, until around 565. It's hard to date the exact fall of the Western Roman Empire, or, some scholars debate whether or not it fell at all. Some might say that it actually just evolved into something different. But this last period is called the Byzantine period, in which we have a very kind of separate cultural group in the Eastern Roman Empire that continues on. But let's roll back to this guy named Julius Caesar, who was active during the Republican period. So here on this slide, you can see Julius Caesar on the left and Pompey on the right, and these are two of the three men who form something called the First Triumvirate. And the triumvirate is just a fancy Latin word that means a group of three men. Trium, right? Three, and viret. Vir is the Latin word for man. And so this alliance, if you can call it that, is active between 60 and 53 BCE. So the third guy in this group of three political men is named Crassus, and it's pretty easy to set up divides between these three. Caesar and Pompey are both very successful military generals, and Crassus is the guy that bankrolls the whole thing. He's the rich dude that funds everything. And it's important not to think of this group of politicians as something like akin to the Democratic or Republican parties. This is a group solely focused on increasing the political power of individual men who did not necessarily share similar political ideals. They were not coming together for a common political goal. To make a long story short, Crassus ends up dying. Caesar and Pompey have had a long feud about lots of different things that aren't necessarily relevant to this class, but so Caesar ends up marching on Rome, and this is where we get the famous quote, Alia jacta est, the die is cast. He crosses the Rubicon with troops into Rome, the first time that this has ever happened in Roman history, and takes the city of Rome. Meanwhile, Pompey withdraws to Egypt and dies, and so then there's no one standing in between Julius Caesar and seizing power over the Roman Republic, which he does, and he does away with a lot of the kind of crumbling power structures of the Republic and institutes his own reforms. Lots of senators hate this. They see it as tyranny and a monarchy, which they fought so hard to not have as a part of Roman government, and so he's assassinated by the senators on the Ides of March, thus ending the first triumvirate. But wait, there's more. Octavian, nephew that Julius Caesar had adopted, takes up the mantle of Julius Caesar and forms the second triumvirate with a guy named Mark Antony and another guy named Lepidus. So this is essentially a recasting of the first triumvirate. You have Octavian and Antony, who are great war generals, and Lepidus, again, a rich guy who bankrolls everything. Antony marries Octavia, who is Octavian's sister, in order to strengthen the alliance, but ends up falling in love with Cleopatra in Egypt, and falls out of favor with the Romans. So Octavian and Antony go head-to-head in the Battle of Actium. So Octavian defeats Antony in this town called Actium, which is in Egypt, and he returns to Rome as Augustus. He's formally claimed this title, and he continues to rule as Princeps and Imperator, the first emperor of Rome. So just to put into perspective what these political leaders of Rome did, let's look at some maps. So here's a map of the Roman territory up until the death of Julius Caesar, right, in 44 BCE. You can see it's pretty extensive, but not nearly as extensive as how the Roman Empire looked after Augustus. So everything in orange here is pretty much what Augustus did and what he secured, and then the red is what all of his successors managed to add to the Roman Empire. So as you can see, Virgil is writing the Aeneid during a period of immense cultural change, an immense expansion of Roman territory and political power. And so we can see a lot of those things in his writing, which we'll be discussing over the course of the next 2 weeks.